This work was funded by the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative and completed while I was with the National Wildlife Federation in collaboration with my colleague, Patty Glick. I want to start out by talking just a little bit about the purpose of this document. It was intended to provide foundational information and inform MPLCC priorities and operations as they continued working in 2011 and 2012. The project and the report we produced is a literature review of approximately 250 documents, and it includes looking at climate change impacts, implications for ecosystems, habitats, and species, and adaptation options across the terrestrial ecosystems of the MPLCC region. A note for this presentation that where possible, I did choose the higher emissions scenario for the same reasons prior presenters have done so. And the baselines included are not shown here, but they are usually 1960s to 1990s. I'm going to go over the impacts pretty briefly so I can focus on the implications for the biological communities. The story here for the CO2 temperature and precipitation is that CO2 is increasing, as is temperature, and that there are seasonal seasonal changes in temperature as well. They're actually projected to increase more in the summer in Alaska and the northern BC coast than they are winter over summer. And for precipitation, it's really a story of variability. Overall, the annual change may remain, the change may be about zero or within zero for annual precipitation, with a lot of the overall change occurring seasonally. Throughout most of the MPLCC, increases in winter precipitation are expected and decreases in summer precipitation, with the exception being summers in Alaska, where precipitation is projected to increase. One of the key results of these kinds of changes is that novel climates, or combinations of temperature, precipitation, and other climate factors that have not ever before been in an area may develop, and that ends up being important as some of the other climate impacts begin to manifest. Really briefly, there are a number of hydrologic changes that are important for terrestrial ecosystems. We produced a companion report that went into quite some detail on hydrology, so I've just summarized those here in the first bullet. A couple of other key impacts are about longer growing seasons and frost-free periods. These impact ecosystem productivity a little bit differently throughout the region. In the north, it may help productivity, while in the south, it may hamper productivity, where winter freeze events may cease or delay the winter chilling requirements of a variety of species. The landslides, windstorms, and avalanches are also an important source of disturbance in the MPLCC region. In terms of projections for landslides, it's possible, the projection here is that future landslide patterns may mimic those of precipitation patterns, but there's still a lot more research to be doing there. In terms of altered fire regimes, overall, the general trend across the MPLCC region is that fire frequency and severity is projected to increase. Of course, there's variation, most notably along the wet coastal, really narrow strips along the coastline where fire frequency and severity is not projected to increase. These increases are quite substantial across the region, and this does include in south central and southeast Alaska. One example here from California is that there are three combinations here of models, and all of them project an increase. It's just the amount of increase that's being projected. And there are a number of other studies in the report, but this was the nicest looking image. So, and you know, everything was beautifully aligned at home. I'm sorry that it's kind of bleeding over and not looking so great here. But in south central Alaska, the key source of disturbance is spruce bark beetle. And looking ahead toward 2100, the key concern here, not only in south central Alaska, but throughout its range in the MPLCC region, is that the beetle may be able to produce in 1 year instead of the typical 2 years, and that means that the overall population could end up increasing over time. The beetle tends to attack only mature spruce trees, and some of the projections for south central Alaska suggest that once a tree is mature, it could almost immediately be attacked by spruce beetle, which would obviously have quite devastating consequences for that ecosystem. Another key impact in the northern MPLCC region is around yellow cedar decline, and I'm not sure if there are other presentations here, but I'll just go over briefly what this is. Yellow cedar is a culturally and economically important species in Alaska. It has a shallow root system and grows in a variety of soils, including wet soils. And what happens is that the snow cover provides an insulator, And as snow cover has declined over the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, the roots have been dehardening early and then refreezing, and that's causing extensive mortality across this region. In terms of what may happen down the line, there are a few options. It could migrate, the species either individually or as a species could migrate to the Yukon Territory, either naturally or with the assistance of managers should they decide to do so. It could persist because there are a lot of interacting factors, and I just highlighted the key ones. So it could actually persist in its current range where conditions are suitable, and where conditions are unsuitable, we might expect it may be outcompeted by western red cedar, and that the overall assemblage of trees may change as a result. A couple of other key insect pathogen and disease impacts in the MPLCC region include Swiss needlecast, which affects Douglas fir retention of the needle and growth of the needle. And this is especially true under warm, wet conditions. So where projections, if we start looking at more of a warm, wet future, Swiss needlecast would be expected to follow wherever Douglas fir was in those areas, and that's where those projections in the last couple items there come from. If we have a warmer and especially a wetter climate, it may expand into central Oregon and inland, and where climates become drier a little farther south, you might expect the epidemic to decline. Sudden oak death is the other key one, and there was a nice introduction on the range of this species in the prior presentation. Sudden oak is susceptible to climate change in a variety of ways. During a heavy precipitation event, it's more likely to be infested by the pathogen. It has an optimal growth range right now that potentially could be exceeded, and that would help it out. And then once the tree is under a drought condition, it's also more susceptible to attack. So there are a variety of ways in which oak species could be stressed. So that was really fast. I wanted just to take a moment here, and these are the impacts here on the left, and I want to just make sure I have plenty of time to dive into the implications for the ecosystem's habitats and species. So just a reminder that the things on the left are leading to the things on the right. First, soil conditions in the MPLCC region, we're looking at increased moisture stress in the spring and summer. In places like British Columbia, that moisture stress may be relieved in the winter as precipitation increases, or in others that may not be the case. You can see here in the bottom graph that soil moisture anomalies are projected to increase quite a bit on the coast of Washington and along the Cascade Mountains, whereas in southern Oregon and in northwest California, the changes are not as severe. Warmer winter soils, as I mentioned before, could have a couple of impacts depending on where they occur in the region. The big concern, I think, here is for Douglas fir and other species that require a freeze event for optimal growth conditions, and those events could decline or go away. Finally, carbon storage in the MPLCC region is among the highest in the world. So it's a natural carbon sink for the world, which is wonderful. The sad part about it is that some of the projections, especially under a hotter and I believe wetter scenario, are for declines in carbon storage throughout the region. But if it were to be a hotter and drier future, carbon storage could increase. Changes in forest composition. Here, there are a couple examples from throughout the region. A lot of these studies are from the statistical models that one of the prior presenters went over, so they don't include the biological processes that can really impact what eventually happens. I mean, a lot of these trees are well established, and while they're established, there are new species coming in. So what we could see in Northwest California, for example, is a shift from evergreen conifer ecosystems to mixed evergreen forest. And in the Oregon Coast Range, an introduction of more subtropical species such as Pacific madrone. Also in Southeast Alaska, it may grow to be a little warmer and wetter than it is today. Wow, this is really poorly aligned. I'm sorry about that. Range shifts, expansions, and contractions there's information available for specific tree species throughout the MPLCC region. Some of these are those statistical models that lack the biological processes, and others do include those biological processes, so it kind of varies here, and I would suggest taking a look at the report for specific questions. Where you're looking at expansions, these are the lovely pictures. These are several specific tree species that may remain climatically suitable in their existing range and also be able to expand into new areas as climate changes. The key contractions are areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change, some of the high elevation habitats we were just learning about. In south central Alaska, for example, trees and shrubs are expected to replace much of the alpine and tundra habitat. Non-forested habitats such as the oak woodland, savannas, and prairies are really important in the southern NPLCC region. And here the story is that they could expand because they do like warmer, drier climates, but it depends a little bit on how land use changes and kind of how warm and dry it gets. There also may be natural shifts back to shrub and grass habitats as trees fall off from drought stress or other climate-related stressors. Really quickly here, there are a number of species that are dependent on oak, woodland, and other prairie or non-forested habitat ecosystems. Some of these have trouble colonizing outside of their preferred species, such as the Propertius dusky wing on the bottom there. The story for birds in these habitats is pretty good. In California, these birds were among the least vulnerable in an assessment of vulnerability of, I think, 500 bird taxa. And because the range of the oak woodland could expand or reestablish, several of these birds could retain or acquire new habitat. Overall, in the western US, about 57% of forest birds using a single habitat type are quite vulnerable to climate change. Although throughout the NPLCC region, the story does vary quite a bit. There are some birds that may benefit from increased forest fire intensity, while others will remain at high risk from changing fire, temperature, and precipitation regimes. Others may move north as climate becomes suitable for them, such as the gray-crowned rosy finch. While rosy finches and white-tailed ptarmigan that are currently living in high elevation habitats may be pushed out, as those habitats are also pushed out. At the same time, though, Alaska's blue grouse may be able to move up with the Sitka spruce habitat as it also moves upslope. So there's quite a few changes that could happen in bird communities. I wanted to note that there are also projected changes in migratory and breeding patterns throughout the region. Trumpeter swans and several birds along the coast in British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest are breeding longer, whereas Wilson's phalarope is having a bit of a shorter stay in its breeding area. The range of trumpeter swans is also projected to increase northward and westward into Alaska. There are a couple of well-known butterflies in the region, Aeolus checker spot and sachem skipper, and they are both on the move, both moving northward. The checker spot is also moving upward in elevation, and the skipper is also making a move across the Cascade Mountains. For mammals, a key impact for the large iconic mammals are milder and less snowy winters. These may further isolate habitat for snow-dependent wolverine and potentially benefit other species as their forage foods increase. For Canada lynx, the story here is interesting because it depends a lot on what happens to snowshoe hare with climate change, as that is its primary source of prey, and also how the lynx competes with other predators such as wolves. For the smaller mammals, there's a study from the southwest Yukon that shows that red squirrels started breeding 18 days earlier in response to increased food abundance and spring temperatures in the late 20th century. Other small mammals, it really depends. These are really important, especially up in Alaska. They're some of the only small mammals there, and they move around a lot of nutrients in the forest. So what happens to them could have big impacts on the forest overall. And I wanted to just finish up with this slide and one other one, and note that one of the things that's really important about the ways in which the ecosystems in the NPLCC region are changing is that on top of the novel climates I mentioned earlier, you have species that are migrating at different rates into different places. And this introduces the possibility not just of novel climates, but of novel community assemblages. And that is going to present interesting challenges and opportunities for managers. I don't think I have time to go into these, but the point of this is to demonstrate that basically for any impact you have, there are a variety of options you can look at to address the impacts you're facing. And as you get into some of the more complex implications around habitat loss and transition and changes in community composition, you have a wider range of tools to choose from. I wanted to say thank you very much to the MPLCC for their funding, and to our reviewers of the report, and to all of you for your attention. Thank you.